She was my aunt's best friend, graceful, untouchable, and years ahead of me. But the night she leaned in and whispered, "You're grown now. Come closer." Everything I thought I knew about boundaries, desire, and love began to blur. Family gatherings at my aunt's house had always been familiar ground. The clinking of dishes in the kitchen, the chatter of cousins I hadn't seen in months, the comforting scent of cardamom tea steeping on the stove. It was the kind of place where time seemed to pause, where everyone fell into their usual roles. I expected nothing more than laughter, food, and the usual warmth. But then she walked in, my aunt's best friend. I had met her before, of course, a handful of times over the years, always in passing. But that night, I saw her differently. She wasn't just my aunt's friend anymore. She was a presence, someone who seemed to carry the room without demanding it. She was in her mid-40s, with a calm kind of beauty that didn't need decoration. Her hair, loosely tied back, shimmered with soft brown highlights under the light. Her smile wasn't wide, but it was steady, the kind that made you feel seen. When she greeted me, it was with a hug that lingered just slightly longer than expected. The faint trace of jasmine perfume clung to her, delicate but intoxicating, and for a fleeting second, I felt her hand pressed gently against my back. A small gesture, but one that set my chest burning. The night carried on, full of chatter and laughter, but I kept finding my eyes drawn to her. Not intentionally at first, just drawn. She laughed at my uncle's jokes, passed plates across the table, moved gracefully from one conversation to another, and yet, every so often, I'd catch her glancing at me. Quick, fleeting looks, gone before I could be sure they were real. Later, when the room had grown louder, voices overlapping, music playing faintly from the corner, she leaned in close to speak to me. Her breath brushed warm against my ear, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "You're grown now, come closer." It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. Soft, steady, threaded with something I couldn't quite name. The words sank into me, charged with meaning I didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. I turned toward her, trying to read her face, but she was already looking elsewhere, as if the moment hadn't happened, as if I had imagined it. Still, my pulse raced in my throat, and I couldn't shake the weight of her whisper. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I answered questions from relatives, smiled when expected, but my mind stayed locked on that single sentence. "You're grown now." She had seen me before, of course, but never like that. Not as a boy tagging along at family dinners. Not as someone still figuring out his place. She had seen me differently, and whether she meant to or not, with that whisper, she had pulled me into a space between what was ordinary and what was about to change forever. The next few hours felt like a quiet game no one else in the house knew was being played. The living room filled with laughter, the clink of teacups, and the occasional swell of conversation that drifted from one corner to the next. To everyone else, it was just another family evening. But to me, the air had changed. She sat across from me at first, her posture relaxed, one leg crossed over the other. She listened attentively whenever someone spoke, smiling softly, adding a thoughtful word here and there. But every so often, when the others were distracted, her eyes found mine. Just for a second, maybe two. Enough to stir something in me, enough to make me wonder if I was the only one who noticed. When she moved closer, it wasn't obvious. She simply rose to fetch something from the kitchen, then returned and chose the spot beside me on the couch instead of where she had been before. The cushion dipped under her weight, her shoulder nearly brushing mine. I told myself it was coincidence. But when her knee shifted and barely grazed mine, when her hand rested lightly on the cushion between us, the air grew heavier. She asked about my life, her voice low and calm, as if she genuinely wanted to know. Not the kind of polite questions adults usually ask younger men at family gatherings. She didn't ask what I did for work or whether I was saving for the future. She asked what inspired me, what made me restless, what I dreamed about when I couldn't sleep. I told her more than I expected to. About the uncertainty I carried, the feeling of standing on the edge of something but not knowing what. She listened without interruption, her eyes steady, her presence so intent that I felt every word mattered. At one point, as I spoke, her hand shifted just slightly, brushing the back of mine. The touch was so light it could have been an accident, but she didn't move it away quickly. Instead, she let it linger near mine, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. The room around us blurred, the noise of relatives and music softening into background static. Her expression gave nothing away. She wasn't flirting in any obvious sense. She wasn't playing with her hair or laughing too loud. She was simply there, close, her presence wrapped around me like a quiet gravity. Every gesture felt like an unfinished sentence. Every silence like a word she was daring me to say for her. And though I sat still, heart pounding, I realized I was leaning, not physically, but in every other way. Leaning toward her voice, toward her attention, toward the quiet storm building in the spaces between our words. By the time someone called me over to the dining table, my chest was tight with something unspoken. I rose reluctantly, and as I did, I felt her eyes follow me. A glance, brief but undeniable. It left me with a thought I couldn't shake. Whatever had begun between us wasn't just in my imagination. It was real, and it was only getting stronger. By the time the evening began to fade, most of the noise had gone. My cousins left one by one, the front door opening and closing with their laughter trailing into the night. The house quieted into that comforting hum of a place settling down. The clatter of a few last dishes, the muffled shuffle of my aunt moving upstairs. I found myself in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, when she walked in carrying a tray of empty teacups. Her presence seemed softer now, stripped of the distractions of the evening. The overhead lamp cast a warm glow on her features. The curve of her cheekbones, the faint tiredness around her eyes that didn't take away from her beauty but added to it, like she carried more than she ever said out loud. Without asking, she reached into the cupboard and pulled out 2 cups, filling them with tea. She handed one to me, her fingers brushing mine briefly as the porcelain changed hands. Even that small contact sent a shiver through me. We sat at the small kitchen table, the quiet wrapping around us. She stirred her tea slowly, then looked at me with a gaze that seemed to hold more weight than casual conversation. "You know," she began softly, "there are choices in life that stay with you. Roads you didn't take, words you didn't say." Her voice wasn't dramatic, just honest, as if speaking to herself as much as to me. She talked about paths she had walked, relationships that didn't last, dreams that had been postponed until they faded. She wasn't bitter. She was reflective. There was a strength in the way she admitted her regrets, a kind of vulnerability that made me see her not just as my aunt's friend, but as a woman who had lived, lost, and kept going. I found myself opening up in return, more than I ever expected. I told her about how restless I often felt, about how I carried this constant weight of not knowing where I was supposed to be. I admitted that sometimes I felt like a boy pretending to be a man, waiting for someone to point out I didn't belong. She didn't laugh. She didn't dismiss it. She just listened, her eyes steady, her silence more comforting than any words could have been. And then, without hesitation, she reached across the table and laid her hand over mine. Her palm was warm, grounding, her fingers lightly curling around the side of my hand. It wasn't a bold move, not a declaration, but it was real. I felt a steadiness flow through me, as if her touch alone was saying, "I hear you. I see you." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The clock ticked softly in the background. The tea grew cold, but I barely noticed. What I noticed was the way her thumb brushed once, unconsciously, against the back of my hand. A small motion, almost nothing. But to me, it felt like everything. And in that quiet kitchen, with the world outside asleep, I realized something had shifted. We weren't just talking anymore. We were beginning to understand each other in a way words could barely hold. When the night finally came to a close, the house had fallen into a hushed stillness. My aunt had already gone upstairs, leaving only the 2 of us lingering in the quiet. She insisted on walking me to the door, a simple courtesy, yet it felt like something more. The hallway light spilled across her face as she stood a little too close, her presence filling the space in a way that made it hard to breathe. I slipped on my jacket, but her hand reached out, smoothing a wrinkle on my sleeve, her touch grazing the skin of my forearm. It was such a small gesture, ordinary in appearance, but the intimacy in it was undeniable. For a moment, I couldn't look away from her. Her eyes, usually calm, playful even, seemed different. Searching, unsure. I felt her hesitation hanging between us, like the pause before a question you're afraid to ask. I could see the battle within her, in the way her lips parted slightly, then pressed closed. Her hand lingered on my arm longer than it should have, warm through the fabric, sending currents through me. She didn't speak right away, but her silence was heavy, filled with everything she wasn't saying. Then, finally, she whispered, "We shouldn't." Her voice was soft, but not stern. It wasn't rejection. It was conflict. The words trembled, as though she was trying to convince herself more than me. Her eyes flicked away, then back, holding mine for a heartbeat too long. I should have stepped back. I should have given her space. But instead, I stayed rooted there, caught in the pull of her presence. The air between us was thick, humming with a closeness that felt dangerous but irresistible. I could hear the faint catch of her breath, could almost feel the warmth radiating from her even without touch. I thought she might lean in then. I thought the moment would tip, and all the unspoken tension would finally break. But just as her hand slid slightly down my arm, she pulled away, too quickly, almost sharply, as if afraid of her own impulses. She bit her lip, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It's late. You should go." The words stung, though her tone was gentle. It wasn't dismissal, not truly. It was self-preservation, a wall she was trying to keep intact. I nodded, forcing a smile, though inside I felt a restless ache. She opened the door for me, the cool night air rushing in. As I stepped outside, I glanced back once more. She stood framed in the doorway, her hand gripping the edge as though holding herself steady. Our eyes met briefly, and in that look, I saw it. The same pull, the same conflict, the same wanting she tried to deny. I left, but her presence clung to me, wrapped around me like her perfume. And though she had whispered, "We shouldn't," everything in her silence had already told me the truth. This wasn't over. Not even close. The morning after should have been ordinary. I told myself I'd forget the look in her eyes, the softness of her hand against my arm, the whisper that lingered long after I left. But ordinary slipped away as quickly as I tried to catch it. By midday, I was restless. Every sound, every moment felt hollow, as if something had been left unfinished. I told myself I had a reason, that my aunt still needed help with errands, that I could be useful. But beneath that excuse was the truth. I wanted to see her again. Needed to. When I arrived, my aunt was busy in the garden. And there she was, seated in the living room, sunlight spilling across her in soft golden light. She looked up from the book in her hands, and for a brief second, the air between us tightened. Her eyes widened slightly, not with surprise exactly, but with something she tried to cover by closing the book too quickly. "You're back," she said lightly, as though my presence was nothing unexpected. But I noticed the way her voice dipped, the way her fingers fidgeted with the edge of the book. My aunt called from outside, her voice trailing off into the distance as she stepped away. Silence filled the room, thick and heavy, and suddenly it was just us. I sat across from her at first, trying to pretend I didn't notice the tension pulling us closer. She twisted the ring on her finger nervously, her gaze flickering between me and the floor. Finally, I broke the silence. I couldn't stop thinking about last night. Her breath caught, barely audible, but enough to hear. She leaned back slightly, her hand resting against her lap as if to anchor herself. "You shouldn't say that," she whispered, though her tone carried more vulnerability than warning. "But it's true," I said, leaning forward, my voice steady. "And I don't think you could, either." Her eyes snapped to mine then, wide, conflicted. She opened her mouth, closed it, then looked away toward the window. "It's not that simple. People wouldn't understand. Your aunt." She cut herself off, pressing her lips together as though she'd revealed too much already. I shifted closer, the couch cushion dipping as I sat beside her this time instead of across. The nearness made the air feel warmer, charged. Our shoulders brushed faintly, and neither of us moved away. For a long moment, we just sat there, the quiet pulsing between us. She drew in a shaky breath, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Her hand trembled slightly, betraying the calm expression she tried to hold. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted softly. "You don't have to know," I murmured. "We'll figure it out." Her gaze lingered on me then, raw and unguarded, and in that look I felt everything she hadn't said aloud. Fear, longing, a pull as strong as the one twisting inside me. We didn't kiss. We didn't cross the line fully. But in that fragile silence, with our shoulders pressed together and her hand twitching as though aching to reach for mine, the truth became undeniable. This wasn't a passing moment. This was the beginning of something neither of us could keep pretending away. Evening fell with a gentleness that made the air feel heavier, as though the world itself had slowed to watch. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in muted streaks of rose and amber. My aunt had excused herself early, leaving us in the soft stillness of the house. She suggested a walk in the garden, just to breathe, she said, and I followed without hesitation. The garden stretched behind the house, quiet except for the faint hum of cicadas and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Roses stood in neat rows, their fragrance thick in the cooling air. We walked side by side at first, not speaking, the silence between us charged with everything we had not dared to say. She stopped near the edge of the garden, resting her hand on the wooden fence. The light touched her face gently, catching on her eyes, and I saw something raw flicker there. Not just hesitation, but longing. "I shouldn't be here like this with you," she whispered, her voice barely rising above the evening air. I stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth of her body radiating through the few inches between us. "Then why are you?" I asked softly. Her breath hitched. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she let her gaze fall to the ground, her fingers tracing absent patterns on the wood as though stalling time itself. "Because," she paused, swallowed, then lifted her eyes back to mine. "Because I can't seem to stay away." Something inside me broke open at her words. Carefully, not wanting to startle her, I reached for her hand. My fingers slid into hers, tentative at first, waiting for her to pull away. But she didn't. Instead, she squeezed lightly, her touch trembling yet firm, like a confession made without words. She let out a shaky breath, and her shoulders seemed to soften, as though the fight inside her had worn her down. Slowly, she leaned into me, her forehead pressing lightly against my chest. I froze for half a second, then wrapped my arms around her, holding her carefully, as though she might disappear if I wasn't gentle enough. Her cheek rested against me, and I felt the quiet rhythm of her heartbeat against my ribs. It wasn't steady. It raced, skipping with the same restless pulse that thundered in me. I closed my eyes, breathing in the scent of her hair, roses mingling with the faint trace of jasmine that clung to her. For that moment, the world outside ceased to matter. There was no judgment, no age difference, no unspoken rules, just the two of us, holding on in a space that felt impossibly fragile and impossibly real. "I've been fighting this," she whispered into my chest, her voice barely audible. "But I don't think I can anymore." I tightened my hold around her, pressing my cheek lightly against her hair. "Then don't," I murmured. "Not with me." The garden swayed around us, the night settling deeper, and I knew this was no longer about hesitation. It was about surrender. The days that followed were quiet on the surface, but inside me everything was loud. Her face lingered in every thought, her touch replayed in every heartbeat. I wondered if she felt the same, if the memory of that night in the garden followed her the way it followed me. It was 2 evenings later when I saw her again. I had stopped by to visit my aunt, though in truth I hoped she might be there. And she was. She arrived just as the sun was lowering itself into the horizon, carrying a soft shawl around her shoulders as if she already knew she'd be staying a while. We greeted each other carefully, politely, as though the air between us hadn't already shifted. But when my aunt left us briefly to take a phone call, the pretense fell away. The silence we were left in wasn't awkward. It was heavy, waiting. She moved first, stepping out onto the porch. I followed, drawn as naturally as a tide pulled toward the shore. The wood beneath our feet creaked softly, and the golden light of sunset stretched across the yard. She sat down on the old bench swing, the kind that swayed just slightly with the weight of its occupant. I sat beside her. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Her shawl slipped from one shoulder, and without thinking, I adjusted it for her. My fingers brushed her collarbone lightly as I did, and she stilled, her breath catching. Finally, she broke the silence. "I've tried to reason with myself," she said quietly. "To remind myself of the years between us, of what people would say, of what your aunt would think." Her eyes glistened in the fading light, but her voice didn't waver. "But when I close my eyes, I don't see all that. I just see you." I turned to her, every word sinking deep. "Then maybe we've been making it harder than it is. Maybe it's not about them. Maybe it's just about us." She looked at me then, really looked. All the walls she had built seemed to slip away in that gaze. Her hand lifted, tentative at first, before resting on mine. Her fingers curled slowly, deliberately, weaving between my own. "You make it sound so simple," she whispered. "Maybe it is," I said, squeezing her hand. "If we choose it." The sky deepened into shades of violet and indigo, the first stars beginning to flicker above. She leaned into me then, her head resting gently against my shoulder. I felt the warmth of her, the trust in her weight, and for the first time, it didn't feel fragile. It felt certain. She turned her face toward me and pressed her lips softly against my cheek. Not hurried, not hesitant. A quiet, deliberate choice. In that moment, I understood something. We weren't stepping into some forbidden secret. We were stepping into something real, something ours. And as we sat together on that porch, the night rising around us, I knew this was no longer about whispers or stolen glances. It was about two people, imperfect, uncertain, but brave enough to stop pretending. We had chosen each other, and that was enough.